Okay, tell me about Oliver Anthony. You brought him up as a possible thing to
Hmm.
talk about. Who
Yeah,
is
just in
Oliver
terms
Anthony?
of, yeah, I mean, I
Because
don't
I haven't talked
follow a
about him
lot
yet.
of, right. Oh, you have? Oh, that's funny because I mean, he's everywhere,
I
man.
know
He's got,
I'm familiar somewhat, but
yeah,
explain who he is to the audience.
right. So he came out with this song, Rich Men North of Richmond, and it instantly got these millions of views. And that's always an interesting phenomenon to me when it's just like, I'm just a humble YouTuber and I'm getting millions of views. It's like, you know, I'm very skeptical of the idea that we have this neutral algorithm and that, popularity is just an accident. It's just whatever people like. I mean, I'm related by marriage to the people who started rap music. And by the way, they weren't black. Music producers are very important. And the function of the producer in promoting certain artists and not others is still relevant today in the way that social media popularity occurs. So all of these people are sort of hand selected, and I think Oliver
Wow.
Anthony is one of them. But putting kind of the conspiracy theories
I'm
aside,
surprised to hear you
uh,
say that. Yeah, interesting.
well, I mean, it's just a fact,
All right.
and that's part of my worldview is just that culture is not something that's organic from it's just whatever we like. I mean, there's so many different talented musicians, and I've met
Yeah.
them who will never be popular, who no one will ever know just because they don't have the right connections. And that the stuff that you watch on TikTok, the stuff that you watch on YouTube, most of what is popular is chosen by some board of directors, by some producer. And again, I have personal anecdotal experience with these people, but you can just read the publicly accessible history on Wikipedia to know that whether it's the Beatles, whether it's Elvis, whether it's the Jackson Five, I mean, all of these are created not of people's, a popularity contest among people, but they are shoved in front of the people, and through repetition, people become familiar with them and they like them. Doesn't mean they're not talented, but a lot of people are talented. And I say the
Right.
same thing about Oliver Anthony. The kind of themes he's putting out, it's totally victimary. It's totally, these guys control everything and everything sucks. And then it's
Yeah.
just like there's so many weird contradictory things, but that's the state of the Republican Party, is that on the one hand they're like these free market anti-welfare people, but on the other hand it's like, oh, poor me, I'm a victim of the establishment. So, you know, I don't think there's really a well grounded philosophical, like coherent message being put out there. It's kind of just a conglomeration of different complaints coming from different, the libertarian tradition, and then the kind of like the rural tradition and the populist tradition. And it's being put out there, and then you see the responses and you see the pushback, right? And there was something that he had like an anti-Semitic playlist on YouTube, and that
Oh
was a
wow.
big deal. Yeah, it was something about like connecting. I don't really want to describe what it is out of, we respect YouTube and everything. So I'll just say it was some terrible thing. But anyway, there was that showing up. And then there were all of these tweets he was putting about I'm not left or right. I don't really support Trump or Biden. I'm like this neutral guy. And he was getting all of this support from people. And you go in the top YouTube comments, and it's interesting. Like I think the top YouTube comment when I checked it was like, I'm a black man, but I work this industrial job, and he's exactly right, and we need to all stand together and unite as working class people.
Yeah.
And I just think that message is fundamentally flawed. I've seen a lot of different presentations of it. But I just don't think that has ever worked historically. That even Marxism, which is the original kind of working class ideology, right? We're going to get the proletariat together, workers of the world unite, we're going to take over. That still has actually never happened, right? The people who actually take over are people who have most of the times never worked a job in their life. Like Stalin was actually trained as a priest.
Huh.
Funny enough, that's his educational background. Lenin, Trotsky, these were intellectuals. And then they actually became bank robbers and then later military leaders. And that's really how they took power, not by, well, we all work a union job and we're just going to organize and get together. I mean, that might be a legitimizing ideology for a new system of power. But, working class people in the Vedic system, there's a breakdown of different roles of jobs in society. Now, the laws of Manu kind of make these into hereditary positions that if your dad was, a soldier, you're going to be a soldier. If your dad was a tradesman, you're going to be a tradesman, that kind of thing. But the description of the jobs in themselves need not be hereditary. And, modern scholars like Prabhupada basically say, this is a description of your position in society. It's not a description of your heredity, or, you're not stuck in this position because that's who your dad was. So basically, the Vedic term is Shudra, which means someone who is a skilled worker. And that's differentiated even in modern India today from Dalit, which is someone who's basically doing, a street sweeper, someone who's doing completely unskilled labor. And a Shudra would be a union man. It would be a plumber. It'd be an electrician. It would be, a lumberjack or something like that. And those people have never led society traditionally. They've never created revolutions. So whenever you hear people engaged in that kind of like working class ideology, I'm always skeptical of that. I'm always asking, are these people buying their own BS, or is this actually a cynical ploy to control these people by making them feel like they're in charge? Yeah, we represent you, but it's actually being redirected towards something completely different.
That reminds me of these supposed working people who become politicians, like Joe the plumber who died recently, who confronted Obama 12, 15 years ago, something like that, about the situation of working people and businessmen. And he became a politician. And a lot of these working people are becoming politicians now. And they're not very effective politicians. So they're just kind of like, it's like this fake, feel-good story. Oh, we finally have one of the people running the show. And they become just as weak and disappointing as anybody who's up there in politics. With Oliver Anthony, my impression of Oliver Anthony was he came out with this song, working all day for bogus speech pay to clean it up a little bit. And the rich men north of Richmond, which I guess, I don't know geography, but I think that means the DC politicians and governing classes are rich men north of Richmond are all meddling in our lives and want to know what we're up to. And they don't think that you know, but I know that you know, and it's a darn shame. And you're right, it is a bunch of complaining. And it does sound sort of, it's total victimhood.
It romanticizes being a victim, and there's no path to victory. There's no path to success. There's no path to betterment. It's just, we're victims because of these, basically our daddy in Washington is being bad to us. We're abused children, and there's nothing we can do about it other than complain and maybe burn the house down and maybe lash out. That's the only really implicit call to action is, we should drop out of the system. Maybe we should do something radical or extreme. Maybe we should get violent about it. I mean, because there's no productive prescription of, maybe we should become entrepreneurs. Maybe we need to start a business. Maybe we need to start a new religious movement or a church. Maybe we need to turn toward God. I mean, there's nothing, I don't see anything about Jesus in that song.
No.
So it's like, my question is, what is the answer other than complaining? And I see it on the left, I see it on the right, and it seems like a slave mentality. I mean, you actually have old slave songs that are like, we're slaves and there's nothing we can do. And like, you can look back at those old songs and be like, what's the difference between that and this?
Yeah. He reads from I saw a clip of him reading from the Bible about God will put you guys on top again because you're righteous or something like that. Mm-hmm. And so he's not, I don't think of him as, I just think of him as sort of young and basically, well, I call him a liberal, because I call all musicians liberals. A liberal, silly sort of musician who's trying to sing about life, and he's relatively young and naive. That was my impression of him. And it's interesting too because he's kind of like the people whom you talked about, the losers. I call them losers among us, who. What was I gonna say? He's talented. He doesn't know what he has, and man, I lost my thought. But basically, it's defeatist, and he's one of the losers who's semi-talented but doesn't really know what he's talking about, and not going to really affect anything but to keep the people asleep. It's all like feel-good mess. Kind of like what we were talking about with the complaining about shouting at the football players, I guess.
Oh yeah, no, it's the exact same thing of, yeah, some people interpreted it as this is a Let's Go Brandon style song,
Yeah,
and in that vein, yeah, I mean that political slogan is just so silly to me. And,
yeah,
it's not to say that if we go back in the annals of history, we can't find really vicious political attacks. I mean, if you go back to the 12th century, you can find these monasteries where monks from competing factions of Pope and anti-Pope would just say, you guys are engaged in necromancy and you're evil and you're doing all these things. So it's not to say that polemics haven't been used, but I find like, let's go, Brandon. It's just so lame. Like if you're going to be polemical, like, I don't know, say something bold, like say something powerful, say something substantive. But the fact that that's become a conservative slogan, it really does sound like a sports cheer. It sounds like something you'd have two football. Let's go, Brandon. Yeah, it's the exact same cadence and everything. So the psychology, it seems, is really silly, and it's not something that I respect. I
yeah,
understand why people who have nothing going on in their lives view it as a form of entertainment and they get engaged with it in the same way that people play video games and watch pornography and do all the other modern hobbies.
yeah.
Um, but, it's below the standard of what would be required of the type of men who could actually, make an impact in the world and a positive change.
I remembered what I was going to say. Just like the disappointing politicians and the whites, the powerful whites whom you mentioned, like the people who are rich and in the government or whatever, he panders and caters and caves to the so-called left. I think Rolling Stone maybe did a hit piece on him, and he disavowed the right-wingers. And just similarly, the practically every phony politician whom I've ever known of, aside from Trump to a significant extent, has apologized for being right, basically, or apologized where they don't need to be apologizing, and they've catered and caved to what I call the liberals. So he's just like them, even though he became sort of a champion for some people, sort of a
Yeah, I
coward.
mean, it's sad that he was a champion, and I don't know if he's going to have staying power. I don't know if he's going to
Yeah,
continue to be useful, but I think, yeah, I mean, essentially, he and his producers and the network that gave him a chance said, like, hey, we think we can use you. And he said, sign me up. They put out the video, it got millions of views. And then he's been kind of managing his PR, and I don't know, maybe he'll be in the top 100 on the charts in the future. Maybe he'll disappear into obscurity. I mean, the story of the music industry is just people get used up and then they get spit out. I mean, I remember, Kesha as an example of someone who was trying to go down that path of being the big pop hit. And she was just totally psychologically abused and controlled and ended up in the hospital. And just Amy Winehouse. I mean, there's so many different examples of people where it's prostitution. I mean, they use you until they feel that your utility is over, and then I mean, people talk about veterans in this country. If you go off to war, you come back, the VA is terrible. Trump did actually address some of those concerns, but the VA is terrible, and you don't get help, and you end up homeless and drug addicted and so on. it's the same thing in the music industry. It might actually, depending on your perspective, better or worse, but it's like, it's a very violent industry psychologically. I mean, it's not to say that they're literally beating people and attacking people, but in terms of the psychological state of someone who survives, you have to be extremely compliant. You have to be a yes man. When they say jump, you say how high. I mean, there is no freedom. There is no freedom of opinion or anything like that. So everything's very tightly controlled. So I don't know if he's going to be able to survive in that space and continue doing what he's doing. It's not known to me, but yeah, the initial song, I didn't like it, and I saw a lot of people on the right cheering it on. I didn't see, by the way, he says like, I'm neither left nor right. It's like, well, your audience is right wing.
Yeah.
Like, there's no Democrats who are like, yeah, I totally understand his message and I sympathize with him. The left just completely dismisses him as like, he's a crypto Trump supporter. He's bad. They're very united in that sense. Whereas the right seems to, imagine if a left-wing music, like let's say Lady Gaga came out and said, I'm really not right-wing or left-wing. That would be a huge story. That would be
Right.
like Lady Gaga betrays the left. Lady Gaga is a secret fascist. I remember the controversy with Taylor Swift. The reason why she was parodied as a fascist is because she refused to come out and state her. She didn't say anything political.
I know.
And that's what they said. Oh, you must secretly be a conservative. So
our Aryan goddess.
Right. The left, I mean, is in a revolutionary religious mode. They are trying to consolidate their power and their morality. And because of that, they're engaged in the same thing the Catholic Church was engaged in when they were losing power, which is these witch hunts. They're going on these crusades. I mean, that is what dominant religious structures do, is they try to enforce, spread, deepen, and intensify their existing networks. Whereas if you're marginal, all you're really trying to do is survive. You're like, hey, just leave me alone. I don't care what you believe. Just leave me alone and I'll do my thing and you do your thing. So these are the different strategies that you use when you're in a dominant position versus you're in a marginalized position. And, so I think it's logical what's going on. And for the people who are capable of understanding that, I want to share that insight, just because it shouldn't be surprising to us, right? It shouldn't be. I know that people feel like, whoa, this has never happened before. Well, look back at the history of Christianity. Back at the history of Zoroastrianism. Maybe even look at the history of Judaism, or the history of Hinduism broadly. When religions take power and they're trying to consolidate the power, this is the playbook. It's really not that different. We've seen this before in history. Now it's with so-called liberalism, but we're in a transition stage where I think that the morality of today, as much as it might seem dominant right now, I think most people have an intuitive sense that this is not the final stage. This is not the final form. This is not a stable form of morality. There's some things in here that are being experimented with. Just like if you look at the French Revolution, that was a very short form of government that very quickly went to Napoleon, who was an emperor, and he actually kept a lot of the liberal Enlightenment ideas of the revolution, but he also instituted some things that we would consider right-wing or authoritarian. Same thing with Lenin. The communists before Lenin were very kind of like free love, free sexuality, anything goes. And then Lenin started introducing like, no, we're actually going to have monogamy and we're going to ban homosexuality and things like that. So this transition stage that we're going through, I think it's not permanent what we have right now. And I think we should all be preparing for a situation where we expect further changes and we expect some surprises down the line.